always found a mystery. I mean, I think there's an equal mystery on the left and on the right in this regard, is that the more conservative types tend to be very skeptical of big government, and the leftist types tend to be more skeptical of big corporations. Right. Well, so following through the logic that you just laid out, you made the suggestion that one of the things that characterizes people on the left is the belief that government can act as an agent of can and should act as an agent of distribution. Okay. A potential problem for that is the gigantism of the government that does that. Now, the conservatives are skeptical of that gigantism. And likewise, the liberals, the progressives in particular, we'll call them progressives, are skeptical of the reach of gigantic corporations. And I've always seen a commonality in those two, in that both of them are skeptical of gigantism. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about, generally speaking, with regard to the potential for the rise of tyranny is the emergence of giants. And one potential problem with the view that the government can and should act as an agent of redistribution is that there is an incentive put in place, two kinds of incentives. Number one, a major league incentive towards gigantism and tyranny. And number two, an incentive for psychopaths who use compassion to justify their grip on power, to take money and to claim that they're doing good. And I see that happening everywhere now particularly in the name of compassion. And it's one of the things that's made me very skeptical, in particular about the left, and at least about the progressive edge of the left. So I'm curious about what you think about those two. First of all, it's a paradox to me that the conservatives and the leftists face off each other with regard to their concern about different forms of gigantism, and don't seem to notice that the thing that unites them is some antipathy. This is especially true for the libertarians, some antipathy towards gigantic structures per se. And so then I would say, with regards to your antithesis between liberalism and conservatives, the conservatives are pointing to the fact that there are intermediary forms of distribution that can be utilized to solve the social problems that you're describing that don't bring with them the associated problem of gigantism. And it's been shocking to me to watch the left, especially in the last 6 years, ally itself, for example, with pharmaceutical companies, which was something I'd never thought I would see in my lifetime. I mean, for decades, the only gigantic corporations the left was more skeptical of than the fossil fuel companies were the pharmaceutical companies. And that all seemed to vanish overnight around the COVID time. So I know the story. That's a lot of things to throw at you, but it sort of outlines the territory that we could probably investigate productively.
Yeah, so a couple things. I would say that the current political landscape we have, I think, is less. I understand the concept of conservatives supporting corporations and liberals supporting like large government. I think today the divide we're starting to see more and more is more of like a populist, anti-populist rise, or even like an institutional or anti-institutional rise. So for instance, I think conservatives today in the United States are largely characterized with, I would say with populism, in that they're supporting like certain figures, namely right now Donald Trump, who they think alone can kind of like lead them against the corrupt institutions, be them corporate or government. I feel like most conservatives today are not as trustful of big corporations as they were back in like the Bush era, where we would, conservatives would champion, big corporations.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing, because it makes the modern conservatives a lot more like the 60s leftists.
Potentially, yeah.
I mean, that brings us into the issue, too, of whether the left-right divide is actually a reasonable way of construing the current political landscape at all. And I'm not sure it is, but...
Right now, it kind of is, but only because so many conservatives are following Trump. So like your populist, anti-populist thing kind of maps on kind of cleanly to the left and right. It doesn't work with progressives, though, or the far left, because they're also anti-large everything. So in a surprising way, on very, very far left people, you might find them having a bit more in common with kind of like a MAGA Trump supporter than like a center-left liberal. So for instance, like both of these groups of people on the very far left will be very dovish on foreign policy, probably a little bit more isolationist. They're not a big fan of like a ton of immigration or a ton of trade with other countries. They might think that there's a lot of institutional capture of both government and corporations. So both all of the MAGA supporters and the far, far left might think that corporations don't have our best interest at heart and the government is corrupt and captured by lobbyists. Yeah, you'll see a lot of overlap there.
Right.
I think that sometimes there's a couple things. One, this is something I feel like I've discovered. People have no principles. I think that people are largely guided by whatever is kind of satisfying them or making them feel good at the time. I think that's a really important thing to understand, because people's beliefs will seem to change at random. If you're trying to imagine that a belief is coming from some underlying principle or is governed by some internal, like moral or a reasonable code or whatever, I think generally there are large social groups and people kind of follow them along from thing to thing, which is why you end up in strange worlds sometimes where, like the position on vaccines and being an anti-vaxxer might have been seen as something, 10 years ago as kind of like a hippie leftist. And now maybe it's more like a conservative, or it's associated more with like MAGA Trump supporters or whatever. I think as a result of how the social groups move around. When it comes to you mentioned this like gigantism thing. That's another thing where I'm not sure if people actually care about gigantism or if they're using it as a proxy for other things that they don't like. Like, I could totally imagine
Well, I care about it.
Sure. Yeah, you might. Yeah, sorry. It just
That's
in
okay.
general.
That's
Yeah.
okay.
Because like I could imagine somebody saying that like they don't trust like a large government, they think there's too much, prone to tyranny or something like that, but also be supportive of an institution like the Catholic Church, which is literally, one guy who has a direct line
Right,
to
but they
God.
can't tax,
Well, I mean,
and they don't have a military,
that
and
is
they can't conscript you,
true.
right?
Yeah,
And they can't throw you in jail.
that is true. Yeah, I mean,
Right. Well, those are major and significant. I mean, I get the overlap. Don't get me wrong.
Sure. But I'm saying, like, even if you had a local government, like if you had a state government or a tribe, usually they've got some form of enacting punishment. It'll be sometimes more brutal, but they can throw you in jail. Conscription hasn't existed in the U.S. since the Vietnam War.
Yet.
I mean, yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah, true.
So yeah, I think that, I guess when I look at,
Let's go back to the redistribution issue. And so there is reason to ameliorate relative poverty. The problem with that, to some degree, is that most attempts to ameliorate relative poverty tend to increase absolute poverty, and they do it dramatically. And the only solution that we've ever been able to develop to that is something approximating a free market system. I wouldn't call it a capitalist system because I think that's capture of the terminology by the radical leftists. It's a free exchange system. And the price you pay for a free exchange system is you still have inequality, but the advantage you gain is that the absolute levels of privation plummet. And I think the data on that they're absolutely conclusive. And that's been especially demonstrated in the radical decrease in rates of poverty since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, because we've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 4 decades than we had in the entire course of human history up to that date. And that's not least because the statist interventionist types who argued for a radical state-sponsored redistribution lost the Cold War, right? And that freed up Africa to some degree, and certainly the Southeast Asian countries, to pursue something like a free trade economy. And that instantly made them rich, even China. So that's an argument, let's say, on the side of free exchange, but it's also an argument, a twofold argument, pointing out how we ameliorate absolute poverty, which should be a concern for leftists, but doesn't seem to be anymore, by the way, and also an argument for the maintenance of a necessary inequality. Like, I'm not sure that inequality can be decreased beyond a certain degree without that decrease causing other serious problems. And we can talk about that, but it's a complicated problem.
Yeah, for one point of clarification, when you say leftist, what do you mean by that?
Well, I was going with your definition, like essentially that the core idea being something like the central problem being one of relative inequality and distribution of resources, and the central solution to that being something like state-sponsored economic intervention. I mean, there's other ways we could define left and right, and we can do that, but I'll stick with the one that you brought forward to begin with.
Gotcha. Okay. I only want to be clear on that because people get mad if I call myself a leftist. Oftentimes online or especially in Europe or worldwide, leftists will refer exclusively to like socialists or communists, and anybody to the right of that would be considered like a liberal. If you
usually a fascist.
Well, depending on
very rapidly.
Yeah. I just wanted to be clear on that. So I'm absolutely a pro-capitalist, pro-free market guy. I'm never gonna.
Okay. Well, that's good. It's good to get that clear. Why?
Yeah. Because I would argue that when you look at like the fall of the Soviet Union, or you look at the failure of like socialist or communist regimes, I don't know if the issue there was so much redistribution. I think the problem
that was one of many issues.
I don't think it was an issue at all. Actually, I would say I think the issue was command economies.
Wait a minute. What do you mean redistribution wasn't an issue? What the hell do you think they did to the kulaks? That was forced redistribution. It resulted in the death of 6 million people. So maybe I'm not understanding what you mean, but that was redistribution at its like pinnacle.
Sure.
And forced redistribution. And it was brutal.
When I think of the strengths of capitalism, the ability for markets to dynamically respond to shifting consumer demand is like the reason why capitalism and free market economies dominate the world. When you've got socialist or communist systems, command economies, where a government is trying to say, this is how much this is going to cost, this is how much you're going to produce and make. This is a failed way of managing a state economy. Even in places where they still do it, there are always shadow economies and stuff that were in the Soviet Union that prop up where people try to basically ameliorate the conditions that are resulting from said horrible command economy practices. So I guess in a way you could argue a command economy is kind of like redistribution. It's a form of it, but
no, it's a worse problem. If you're pointing to the fact that that's a worse problem, I'm
I would say that's definitely the reason why these places failed, because they just weren't able to respond to changing conditions.
So a state that attempts to redistribute to foster equality of opportunity and a command economy, is it a difference of degree? Like, are you looking at models, let's say, like the Scandinavian countries? Or I wouldn't use Canada, by the way, because Canada is now, predicted by economic analysts to have the worst performing economy for the next 4 decades of all the developed world. So maybe we'll just leave the example of Canada off the table. Sure. Scandinavian countries are often the polities that are pointed to by, I would say, by people who, at least in part, are putting forward a view of redistribution for purposes of equality of opportunity like you are. But they're a strange analogy because they're very small countries, and up till now they were very ethnically homogenous. Exactly. And that makes a big difference when you're trying to flatten out the redistribution. Plus, they're also incredibly wealthy, which makes, redistribution, let's say, a lot easier. So why doesn't a government that's bent on redistribution fall prey to the pitfalls of command economy and forced redistribution, for that matter? How do you protect against that?
I think what you have to do is very, very, very difficult. Is people get very ideologically captured by both ends, and they feel very, committed, or they feel very allegiant to pushing certain forms of economic organization. And I think sometimes it blinds them to some of the benefits of what exists when you incorporate kind of multiple models, or you call them mixed economies, which is really what every capitalist economy today is. It's some form of free market capitalism combined with some form of government intervention to control for negative externalities. These are the ways that all economies, even in Scandinavia and the world, work. And I think that recognizing the benefits of both systems are the best way to,
I have with negative externalities. You made a case already that, and again, correct me if I've got this wrong, but a free market, free exchange economy is a gigantic distributed computational device.
Basically, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Which, funnily enough, one of the big problems for command economies is called the computation problem, because no central body can actually compute, the ins and outs of.
Right, exactly. Right, that's a fatal problem, right? Because it doesn't have the computational power. It certainly doesn't have the speed of data recognition. It doesn't have the on-the-ground agents if all of the perception and decision-making is centralized, right? It's way too low resolution. It's going to crash. Okay, and I think that that's comprehensible technically as well as ideologically. With regards to externalities, all the externalities that a market economy can't compute are so complex that they can't be determined centrally by the same argument. And
there are ways to account for them, though.
Really?
That work with.
Tell me.
Yeah.
How. Because I can't see that. Because I can't see how that they can be accounted for without the same computational problem immediately arising.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I think that's a problem sometimes of people very far on the left when they want to deal with certain problems. I think that they want to bring heavy-handed, things like price controls in to say, well, we need less of this, so let's just make this cost this particular thing, which ironically enough introduces a whole other set of externalities that will happen when you get a lot of friction between where your price floor or ceiling is set compared to what a market was set at. But ideally, if you're a reasonable person and you view economies as mixed economies, what you try to do is you try to take these externalities, meaning things that aren't accounted for with your primary system. So in a capitalist system, an externality might be something that causes a negative effect, but it doesn't cost you any money. Pollution would be a good example of that. And rather than saying no company can pollute this much, or, if you're a company, you have to use these things because the other things are making too much pollution, all you do is you say, okay, well, if we've determined that, say, carbon is bad for the atmosphere, well, we're just going to attach a little price to that. So the government's going to say that, yeah, if you pollute this much, here's the price. And then if you want to pay for it, you can. But that type of intervention in the economy basically allows the free market to hopefully do its job because the government has tacked on a little bit of a price something that tries to account for the cost of that externality. Yeah.
Great. That's a great example. We can go right down that rabbit. Okay. So first of all, one of the things I've seen, you tell me what you think about this, something that I've seen that actually shocks me, that I was interested in watching over the last 5 or 6 years. I wondered what would happen when the left, the progressives, ran into a conundrum. And the conundrum is quite straightforward. If you pursue carbon pricing and you make energy more expensive, then you hurt the poor. And I don't think you just hurt them. In fact, I know you just don't hurt them. I heard a man 2 days ago who's fed 350 million people in the course of his life, heading the UN's largest relief agency, make the claim quite straightforwardly that misappropriation on the part of interventionist governments increased the rate of absolute privation dramatically in the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And that has happened not least because of carbon pricing, not just carbon pricing, but the insistence that carbon per se is an externality that we should control. Now, Germany's paid a radical price for that, for example. So their power is now about 5 times as expensive as it could be. And they pollute more per unit of power than they did 10 years ago before they introduced these policies that were hypothetically there to account for externality. And the externality was carbon dioxide. I don't think that's a computable externality. And I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it's actually an externality that we should be warping the economic system to ameliorate if the cost of that, and it will be an increase in absolute privation among the world's poor. So, and here's an additional argument on that front with regards to externalities. You get that wrong, and here's something you could get right instead. If you ameliorate absolute poverty among the world's 1 billion poorest, they take a longer view of the future. And that means they become environmentally aware. And so the fastest route to a sustainable planet could well be the remediation of absolute poverty. And the best route to that is cheap energy. And we're interfering with the development of cheap energy by meddling with the hypothetically detrimental externality of carbon dioxide. I think this is a complete bloody travesty, by the way. We are putting the lives of hundreds of millions of people directly at risk. right now to hypothetically save people in the future, depending on the accuracy of our projections, 100 years out. And these interventionists, these people who are remediating externalities, they actually believe that they can calculate an economic projection 1 century out. That's utterly delusional.